Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a really fun and wide-ranging conversation with the architect, writer, and curator Rory Hyde. Rory is currently a curator of contemporary architecture and urbanism at the Victoria and Albert Museum, an adjunct senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne, and was recently appointed a design advocate for the Mayor of London. But before all that, Rory was a practicing architect, and we talk about his early career and getting into architecture. We talk about when he interned at Volume, which was the magazine founded by Rem Koolhaas and Mark Wigley, as well as his time co-hosting a radio show about architecture in Australia. He also wrote a really great book a few years ago called Future Practice, Conversations from the Edge of Architecture. And this book really feels like a perfect match for this podcast. He interviews architects, writers, urbanists, and designers who are building sort of expanded practices and practicing architecture in kind of new, non-traditional ways. I just loved the book and got so much out of it, so I was really looking forward to this conversation. In this episode, Rory and I talk about that book and how practicing architecture has evolved. We talk about how he thinks about his role as a curator and staging shows for general audiences, as well as the type of criticism he's drawn to, the type where critics take up and champion causes that they care about. And we talk about why he wants to see more of that. Rory is really a perfect Scratching the Surface guest, and I just love his work and writing and admire the career he's built for himself. So I had a lot of fun talking to him and feel like I learned so much. So I hope that you also enjoy my conversation with Rory Hyde. Has this career that kind of blends architecture and design and writing and curating, and it seems like it all comes from one place. And so I kind of wanted to start with just which of those came first for you? Were you more interested in architecture first or writing first, or how did that begin?
Yeah, it's a good question, and in a way, I'm still looking for the center of what pulls me along. But certainly, to begin with, it was always architecture, and it was always to be a designer. So I studied architecture. I did my undergrad in Melbourne at a school called RMIT, and yeah, I mean the perception or the kind of reputation of RMIT is very much a design heavy. Technology heavy university. And, so that was the world that I was immersed in. It was really architecture as form, architecture as a kind of spatial experiment. And the social or critical thinking came a bit later. So, while I was studying, I was always doing things on the side. And whether that was a bit of teaching or whether it was writing, some curating, but not so much at that point. Okay. Lots of designing, for whether it was a fashion show or a exhibition. Doing these little projects and trying to build stuff as I was going along, always on the side. And in a way, those side projects became the project at some point.
Right.
Yeah.
So did you always have an interest in doing all of those other things? Like back when you were studying architecture, were you always interested in wanting to write or teach or curate also? Or how'd you start incorporating that into your work?
Yeah, I think there was early on, there was always a sense that there's architecture as defined by practice, or as architecture is defined by its media, its output, which is, buildings, if we want to be simplistic. And then there was architecture as a discourse, and architecture as a broader discipline, which could include everything from media to events to arguments online or the way it's taught, the whole broader history of talking about buildings and cities. So as a student, I was invited to first produce and then co-host a radio show, which was called
Right.
The Architects, which was with Stuart Harrison and Simon Knott, who Simon was my boss in practice, and
Okay.
Stuart was my tutor at school. And
wow.
and so we got together every Tuesday night for an hour, 7 p.m., which was a kind of nice time in the day. People are at home cooking dinner, and
Yeah.
they have the radio on.
Right.
We were on a community station in Melbourne called Triple R, which had a great following. They would each year do a call out, and 10,000 people would throw money
Oh, wow.
at the station to keep it alive and keep it independent. So that suggests that there's, again, a whole lot of other people who are listening but may not commit their money. They didn't have proper listener targets, but certainly Triple R is very important to Melbourne as a completely independent community station. So it was a great platform for us to talk about architecture, and really two things. It's on the one hand completely crazy to talk about architecture on radio because you don't have any images there.
Yep. I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
But on the other hand, it forces you to focus on the ideas.
Right.
So we would interview an architect each week. We would talk about the current news or events. We would often do a review of a book or an exhibition. And we did, I think, 350 shows, so over about 10 years. So it ended up being a kind of substantial bit of work. And that's really what took me into architecture in the broadest sense, and questioning what architecture is and what practice is and what it could be, and pushing at those edges of the discipline.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting to me. I feel like I have like five questions that I want to ask kind of based on all of that. I want to pull out something that you mentioned that was really interesting to me about how there's architecture as, basically making buildings or creating form, and then there's the architecture discourse, which is, the media, the writing, the books kind of around that. That's something that's always appealed to me about architecture, and it's why I think I've ended up talking to a lot of architects and architecture critics for this podcast, because practicing architects, as somebody who just looks at architecture as an outsider, seem much more engaged in the discourse around the profession than a lot of graphic designers do. Did you find that that discourse and that other way of thinking, did that change how you thought about your work and your career? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly true, and I wouldn't want to suggest that architecture has any, more or better established, critical space than any other design discipline. But there's certainly something about the speed of architecture which means you have to kind of work on things in another way. Mm-hmm. I imagine with graphic design, you can turn out 50 projects a year. You might have, more clients. There's sort of less overheads. It might be quicker than doing a building, which can take, 3, 4, 5 years from start to finish. So I think possibly for that reason, architecture has needed to develop a kind of independent, parallel track of critical thinking and of ideas. And at some point that might have, become a substantial independent body. Right. So I was certainly attracted to that, and that's what took me to Holland to work for the Volume magazine, and for offices like MVRDV, and even some work on a project called Almanac, which was with OMA and AMO and the Architecture Institute. And really that was for me the center of the world of architecture as ideas and as a kind of more speculative, interrogative, experimental practice that was still connected to buildings somehow. MVRDV is still building things, and that gap between what they're writing about, what they're talking about, and what they're building seemed to be at once both very experimental in terms of the ideas, but also very close to what they were able to deliver through buildings. So I've always sort of bounced between those two spaces, wanting to keep one foot in design and making sure that, the ideas are realized in form, and that somehow buildings are still have that importance and are able to cut through in a way that that an article might not, but to be playing that other side of things as well.
Yeah, I mean, I want to keep talking about that, but I want to mention, I have a quick question. What were you doing at Volume? Were you a writer?
Yeah, I it's funny. I finished my PhD at RMIT, which was about really new technologies and small practice, and how that was that new technologies were creating new models of practice. So it was very much I was playing around with parametric modeling and scripting and Rhino, and I was in the spatial information architecture laboratory, and it was all getting very high tech and big computers, this kind of thing. And at some point I realized, but the future of architecture is it can't just be technological. There's something else out there that's cultural, that's social, that's political, and that's really. So I went to Volume. I felt like that's where that conversation was happening. And I was an intern. Was 2000 and this was 2008.
Okay, nice.
I came to Europe. I applied for loads of jobs as an architect, as a designer, and I got a lot of interviews, got a lot of callbacks, but really so much work was crashing at that point that nothing eventuated. And I thought, well, if I'm going to give my time away. They were saying, "Oh, you can come and intern for us," but that job with the money is not going to happen.
Right.
I said, "Well, if I'm going to give my time away, then I'm going to give it to something I believe in, not something that's commercial."
Yeah.
So that's when I went. That's when I went to Volume. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I love that. I mean,
and I was a writer, researcher. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, Rem Koolhaas and Mark Wigley are kind of my two people that I feel like I try to model my own career after, or they're the two people that I look at as the types of people who are doing the thing I want to do. And so, Volume is where they really come together. So that's amazing that you were there as an intern.
Yeah, and it was actually amazing timing for me as well. So AMO Koolhaas had just got a new project, which is to do another book called Almanac 2, which is about the architecture and urbanism of the Middle East, of the Gulf region mainly. And I'd been there for 2 weeks, and then I'm having coffee with Rem Koolhaas asking if I want to work on this project. So
that is amazing.
It was one of those amazing moments where you just think, right place, right time. I'm sleeping on a friend's floor, but I've just arrived in Holland straight off the boat, and I'm working with the one person who I want to work with. So
yeah, that's it. Do you think? I kind of want to close out this kind of early part of your career to start talking about the things you're doing now. But I'm curious, do you think engaging in those discourses, and whether it's the radio show or kind of writing and researching at Volume, did that have an effect on how you thought about your work as an architect or as a designer? And then vice versa, do you think coming from a background of being a practitioner influenced how you thought about the things you wanted to talk about, the things you wanted to write about?
Yeah, it's I mean, in a way, since being in Holland, my sort of work as a practicing architect has been less and less of my time, and the curating and the teaching and the writing has been more and more. So the two things are running in parallel, and I guess I'm trying to bring them back in line again. More and more now. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I haven't really had a chance to sort of exercise what my design practice might look like now that I've been marinating in ideas for so long, and
right.
and really that will be the test, I think, and I'm looking to do more on that soon. Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly kind of what my next question was, because I was curious, trying to piece together all of these parts in your career. I couldn't figure out if this was kind of a back and forth. You were kind of working as a practitioner, and then you kind of moved in, and now you are, now do you see yourself as a curator and a writer? Or basically, how do those things influence each other, or how do they cross kind of in your own day-to-day even?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, so I'm working as the curator of contemporary
Right,
architecture and
right.
urbanism at the Victoria and Albert in London, which is it's the National Museum of Art and Design and Performance. So we have the National Collection of Architecture, which is mostly drawings, models, and I'm working on making acquisitions for that archive. But
Okay.
equally, we're doing exhibitions. So I'm working on a big exhibition which will open next year called The Future Starts Here. And
Yeah.
that has one bit on architecture, but also it's more broadly about the future of design, technology, and how it's shaping the way we live and the way we think. So, which is all to say that I now find myself almost like a client.
Right.
We're appointed exhibition designers. We've appointed Andres Jaque, who's a Spanish architect based in Madrid. I guess he's also in New York a lot. He teaches at Princeton.
Okay.
His practice is called the Office for Political Innovation,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
and I'm certainly the most annoying client because because I, you know, am interrogating the drawings, and I'm no longer a designer, and I'm frustrated by that.
yeah.
So the kinds of feedback that I give is incredibly annoying, but
Right.
I think it leads to actually a really exciting collaboration with those guys, and trying to push the museum and trying to push each other to raise the bar on what exhibition design can be and what kind of a experience we can create out of this space. But I increasingly find myself on the other side of the table, if you like,
Right.
writing design briefs, commissioning designers, putting together shortlists, whether it's for for another exhibition or for a summer pavilion or putting together different practices that we might want to include in an exhibition or a collection, doing
Right.
studio visits, but not so much holding the pen. No.
Okay. Interesting. I want to connect that to something you said earlier, and then hopefully lead this into a discussion about your book. Because you said something earlier that really resonated with me that I wanted to make sure we talked about a little bit. And as you were kind of talking about these two modes of practice of kind of making form and then the discourse, that architecture always comes back to this idea of the form or the building, and that's kind of where the ideas can
Yeah.
live also. And so I'm curious if you see your work, if you see writing or curating as a type of form building also, even if it's not creating a building or a structure all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it form building. I
Okay.
think, as you say, that's its own thing. I would definitely call it architecture,
Okay.
and that, curating architecture, writing architecture is all part of that broader expanded practice. Um, but architecture and building architecture will always have its own kind of special territory, which attracts a different kind of mind, maybe, or a different obsessive kind of person, which maybe I'm not. I mean,
Yeah.
the one thing I'm much more interested in connecting things
Right.
and rather than in defending things, which is
Oh,
the sort.
interesting.
So when I look at architecture, which I really admire, I think, wow, that's a dedication over a number of years to kind of defend the purity of that idea. And I guess what I'm interested in now is how can I take what I've learned in curatorial practice or in critical practice back to a design studio. So I'm talking in early discussions with some practices about whether it's more as in an advisory role, bringing in particularly for like cultural or arts projects, to bring some of that curatorial experience into the design of the brief or the questioning of the brief or
Yeah.
how it might affect. So, and I really think that that's a big gap in knowledge in professional practice is in understanding the way spaces are occupied or the way different. I mean that's not necessarily, that's not true, of course, but to bring
Yeah, I know what
yeah.
you mean. Do you think that being on the other side, being the client, being a curator or writer, has made you see the design process differently than when you were just a designer?
If I can try and just answer that last question again, which is to say, in practice, I felt like the main or the only tool that we had was form, and that somehow all the ideas that you wanted to achieve needed to be delivered through form, and they needed to be drawn into the project, drawn into the built-in brick. Through working with an institution and engaging with people day to day, and a big public that comes through our doors, and thinking about how to put in ideas in front of them and objects in front of them. I'm thinking a lot more about program, a lot more about what you might call user experience or touch points, and to think, you realize that the company that runs the cafe is just as important as the dimensions of that workspace or those windows, and so thinking much more through program, through the kinds of people that can be used to activate spaces, and that actually there's a broader set of tools that can be brought into architecture that isn't just form driven, in order to create the kinds of spaces and experiences that are more complex or engaged, or welcoming, engaging with the public, or can achieve different kinds of social aims rather than just the tools of architecture, you realize, are quite blunt. They're incredibly powerful on the one hand, in that once they're set in stone, they can reproduce those social consequences over decades or even centuries. But they're also quite, if you want to get into higher resolution, then you need to look elsewhere. You need to look to graphic design. You need to look to service design. You need to look to, as I say, like the design of the cafe. And it's not often in a museum. That's a place where you're forced to think about all of those things in parallel. So trying to bring some of that thinking back into practice is really what I hope to do next.
That's really interesting. And I want to. This might be a good time to talk about your book a little bit, because as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I somehow missed that you wrote a book called Future Practice, and as soon as I discovered this book, I realized that this is kind of all the same things that I'm interested in too. And so I would love for you to talk about the book a little bit and kind of where your ideas for it came from, or kind of the origins of the project, and what you were hoping to kind of do with these interviews that you include in the book, and the kind of what you wanted to add to the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, the idea for the book, which is, it's a few years old now. It's 2012.
Yeah.
It came out of my PhD, which was, as I mentioned before, looking at different models of practice. Mm-hmm. The PhD was mostly focused on technology, but I realized, wow, there are all these other tools or ways of working that are not just the traditional, let's hang up a sign, let's wait for someone to ring us up, let's do what they ask us to do, and try and make it a bit better than it could be. That seemed to be, again, apologies for being extremely simplistic, but that seemed to be the sort of model of practice which certainly at the school that I trained at, was just presumed to be the business model that we would all inherit, and that was how it worked. You either started your own one or you went and worked for someone else, but that's how architecture works. Right. And through my research and through meeting different people from inside architecture and beyond, I realized that model of practice had gone unquestioned for so long, and that actually there are so many other ways of working, not just from a kind of financial business model sense, but also in terms of ways of engaging with the community, or with different technologies, or working collaboratively, or even operating as an activist. That there are so many other ways to change the city. So the idea of the future practice was to go and speak to those people who are working in that way. So rather than to make it too theoretical, which was probably which is the problem with all PhDs, as you know, is they kind of have to be, to just make it very accessible, to go and speak to these people, meet them, ask them how they worked, ask them what they do, and to just share those examples of great ways of working, and hopefully start a conversation around different ways of practicing. And it's funny, I mean, if I can say so, and it's certainly not just me, but I think there was a general sense after the financial crisis of 2008, which I guess we're still living in, that a lot of people started to ask these same questions. And at the time, it felt like very much a fringe conversation. Right now, the idea of talking about other models of practice or other alternate modes of practice feels much more of a mainstream discussion. So it's really great to see that shift happen, and I think there's still lots more to be done.
So did you go back to school for your PhD kind of knowing that this was what you wanted to work on or what you were interested in thinking about?
The PhD happened before the book.
Okay.
And no, this idea came about through getting lost on the way of doing the PhD.
Okay.
It was, when you're halfway through something and then you realize this is what I really want to be writing about.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing that I did next. Yeah.
Okay. I
was just going to say that it's well, I'm at the moment working on the next book, which is kind of picking up where that left off.
Right.
And it's called How to Make the Next City. I'll hopefully have it out early next year. And the idea is to try and close the gap between ways of working and design. So how can some of those ideas be reproduced or be executed through physical form?
I want to ask, I have a two-part question that it's about the same thing. I want to start with a very specific version of the question and then kind of expand it a little bit, because when you were talking about the book and thinking about it, you wanted it to be very accessible and not academic. And that's something that I thought about when I was just kind of starting this podcast also, when I was interested in very similar themes of kind of new ways to talk about graphic design and different ways of working and how the graphic design discourse could change. And I originally thought, I was in an MFA program. I originally thought that this was going to be me writing kind of a text with history and theory, and realized that would just kind of reach the people who are already interested in that thing. And I really wanted to make something that, could kind of go in and hit graphic designers who maybe had never thought about this. And so that's where an idea of the podcast came in, and that it's much more accessible than reading a big academic text. And so I'm curious, the two-part question is how you thought about audience and making something that was accessible and clear in the book, and then kind of pulling out a little bit to all of your work, and especially being a curator at a big museum, how you think about talking about design and the built environment for, essentially a general audience in some sense.
Yeah, great question. I mean, for the book, to begin with, of course, I should say, I don't mean to dismiss all academic writing.
Right.
No, of course, so much of it is brilliant, but you know what I mean when I say I didn't want it to be that. I wanted it to exactly speak to practitioners, or at least address complex ideas without dumbing it down, but in an accessible way. So, and that's something we did with the radio show, and that's something that I've certainly trying to do through the museum, and with the book, which was targeted at architects, but hopefully it's it was the kind of thing that students and practitioners and academics would pick up and equally get something out of. So that was the kind of audience for that one. And then working in a big museum is another different challenge altogether. I mean, we have about 3 million visitors a year at the V&A. Probably half of them are British or, live in the UK, and then half are tourists or international. We have a huge range of topics, so it's not like we're just an architecture museum where once you've walked through the door, it's sort of self-selecting for people who are already initiated. Right. We have everything from medieval jewelry to sculpture and painting and glass and all the rest. So architecture is just one discipline within that big spectrum, which allows, which is actually the great, amazing opportunity of the V&A, which is to be able to put architecture in context and in dialogue with all of that history and all of that wide range of disciplines. And increasingly, that's what we're doing, rather than having dedicated architecture shows, trying to be more cross-disciplinary and putting things in dialogue. But in terms of the audience, how do you get somebody who has never thought about architecture or never, willingly considered it, to be interested, to care? What are the kinds of, and one of the ways that most architecture collections or exhibitions are driven is through authorship and through style. And I guess the work here, which hasn't so much had an impact on the galleries yet, but it's stuff that we're working on at the moment, is trying to find other tools, other ways of organizing architecture that isn't just driven by authorship, isn't just driven by style. So that might be driven by issues like, how can we use architecture to talk about housing affordability, which is such a big thing in London and which probably affects a huge proportion of people who come to see us. How can we talk about the body or experience or sensing architecture? Can we talk about sound? Can we use these other tools or ways into design that might be more accessible, but equally might throw up different questions or different ideas. So we're also talking about events or that somehow this place was implicated in this broader social or political question, and we can then start to talk about design through that lens.
That's so interesting, and it's something. It's a topic that comes up again and again in these conversations that I have, and it's something I think about a lot. Is how do you talk about design, and we can use the broad definition of design, or even specifically architecture or graphic design, in a way that is accessible and interesting for a general audience who had never thought about it before, that moves beyond style and form and starts to talk about ideas, but then is also interesting for the practitioners or the people who are inside it. And how do you balance that? Balance isn't the right word, but how do you hit kind of both of those people, so you're not dumbing it down for the people that are outside of it? You're kind of raising the discourse, and it's adding something to the profession. Do you think that's I have two questions. Do you think that's possible, and how do you think about that? But then also, I really like what you're saying about moving from authorship and style to kind of ideas or issues as possibly a way to do that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we're obviously kind of wrestling with it at the moment.
Yeah.
And this is the I would say the bread and butter of like curatorial practice. So those tiny little decisions. What do you title that section? Mm-hmm. What do you foreground in this in the choice of material you're going to use, which can change the whole experience of that place. And we're a permanent. Nothing's permanent, but we're the. We have a permanent display of architecture, so what we do will likely be there for 10 years, at least. But in terms of, I guess, trying to negotiate between those different parties, we talk about different kinds of visitors, and we also talk about different, levels of engagement. So one of the shorthand, categorizations we have for our visitors are paddlers, swimmers, and divers. So a paddler is someone who, and it's probably what I'm like when I go to another museum, is you kind of, breeze through, you read the top lines, you might read a couple of labels, you get the sense of the whole atmosphere, and then you go and have a coffee.
Yeah.
And really most people are a bit like that. The swimmers, they might be conscious of seeing everything in the right order. And then the divers are the people who, look at everything, take photos of loads of stuff, buy the catalog and read it when they get home. So we're conscious of making our stories, the kinds of stories that we tell, work on all of those three levels, and therefore, provide enough depth for the hardcore professionals or the students or whatever, but also to not alienate the casual visitor.
I'm curious. I kind of want to step back a little bit and not. I don't want you to feel like this next question you have to answer it kind of in regards to your own career. Obviously,
go on.
Obviously
yes,
use your own work, but I'm kind of curious in general how you think about the role of the critic or the theorist or the writer, its relationship to the profession.
I like the critics that take on an issue, or that you might call a kind of try and instrumentalize their work. To use a historical example, it's a real hero of mine. He's not very well known outside of Australia or Melbourne even. Is a guy called Robin Boyd who was he was practicing really since the end of the Second World War up until he died quite young in 1971. So there's about a 30-year period where he was practicing. But he was famously a critic. So he would write. He had a weekly column. He had his own practice. He also wrote big books on the kind of cultural histories of Australia. He was a stinging critic. He had his most famous book is called The Australian Ugliness, which looks at the design of streets and really takes aim at the suburbs and at the clear felling of trees, the ugly sort of kitsch style of the post-war suburb, these kinds of things. And he ran a program called the Small Home Service, which he set up in 1951. And what that was is he had a small design studio, I think a dozen draftspeople. He would design a new modern house every week, and then make the plans available through the service, and then publish a column in the newspaper talking about this house and really advocating for modern design more broadly. I look back at this model of practice as so radical and so potentially relevant today, that could combine big public media presence. And there's a question there about what that would be now when things have become so splintered and the newspapers don't hold the same audience that they did in the 1950s. A sense of economics. So these complete building plans were available for £5. And I don't know what that would be in today's money, but it's certainly a lot cheaper than appointing an architect. Beautifully designed modern homes. A kind of public advocacy. So, championing good design, championing modern design, championing new ways of living, new ways of organizing space, responding to the baby boom of the post-war era and looking forward to different ways of living and how the home could be a guide for that. Just broadly bringing all of those things together. And that for me is the sort of ideal critic. And today you might say, that people who really champion particular causes or foreground. I'm not that interested in like the review of the latest Jean Nouvel building, put it that way.
Right. I suspected as much. I think we're on the same page there. Do you see your work as a curator, as a critical activity, or how does your own kind of point of view or issues that you want to raise manifest themselves in the exhibitions? And I'm especially thinking about the future one and kind of how that looks at Silicon Valley and technology as potentially being a kind of very critical and having a point of view.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I sort of go back and forth with this word critical. On the one hand, I see myself as I try to be positive and to advocate the things. Right. The sense of critical as being like negative is difficult. But to be interrogative and to be engaged, and certainly I support that aspect of the word. the way we're doing that through I should say that the future show is co-curated with Mariana Pestana, my colleague at the V&A. And the way we're, I guess, being critical there is to really take one step back, and look at the new technologies or new kinds of design that we're seeing coming out of Silicon Valley and elsewhere, and asking, what kind of a culture is this bringing into the world, or how is it changing the way we live together or the way we relate to each other? So trying to ask, I guess, more like humanities style questions about technology, and maybe those questions aren't necessarily being asked by the kind of breathless iPhone X reviews which list the number of pixels.
Right.
Does it stop to say, it was one of those things which we use as an example, is, at some point email was available on your phone, and data networks like 3G, 4G became available around the same time. And so almost overnight, we were all expected to check our emails at all hours of the day.
Right.
And presumably nobody asked for that. I certainly don't want that, but I found myself joining this, vast movement of people where that kind of, technical capacity had this huge social consequence. So that's a very obvious example of the ways that technology kind of colonizes everyday life, and we're looking at. I guess we're trying to catalog other examples of those sorts of things.
Right.
Yeah. I would say that's a form of kind of critical practice.
Yeah.
Through curation.
What you're saying about, especially in regards to technology and kind of the new iPhone review and just kind of lists all of the features, and then also saying how you're not interested in kind of architecture writing that's just a review of a new building, and the analogy for graphic design that I feel like I bring up in every conversation that I have is I'm not always interested in the review of, company X's rebrand or how the icons on the new iPhone have been redrawn or something like that. And so I really loved your analogy of when kind of data networks and email came on phones, how that kind of changed human behavior. And I'm wondering what you think the versions of that are or could be in architecture or even in graphic design. I know you don't really work as a graphic designer, but from your view, what are those things that maybe designers or architects or the people writing about graphic design and architecture should be talking about right now?
Yeah. Really good question. And in a way, this is some of the thinking that I'm doing at the moment. I've just written an article that I sent off this morning kind of about this.
Oh, great.
I think that architecture has a big problem at the moment in terms of these broader social obligations or responsibilities. We've completely hitched our wagon to the 1%. It seems to be only luxury now, and that's certainly all you see in the magazines. And I'm not just talking about architecture. I'm basically talking about architects design 3% of the buildings out there by some measures. Certainly of 3% of the houses, which basically means you're ignoring the whole of suburbia. You're ignoring 97% of the population. And from a business perspective, that might make sense. A lot of people will say, small practices certainly will say, it's not worth taking on jobs that are less than $200,000 because by the time you take out your fee and the time it takes, some of those projects take just as long as a bigger project. Why would you say yes to somebody? But of course, it's a huge neglect of the kind of thinking and necessity that your skill is required in. So the broader point is to say that the profession of architecture, which is a kind of social contract, if you like. We agree to provide these services and to regulate ourselves in a particular way, in exchange for exclusivity in the use of the word and in the ability to be able to practice as architects. So that's the sort of social contract that we have as professionals with with society as a whole. And are we in breach of that contract if we're neglecting such a large portion of the city?
Yeah.
So I would like to kind of, put that on the table and just say, what are our responsibilities, and not just as business people, but to society more broadly, and would that reshape the kinds of questions that we're asking or the kinds of places that we make ourselves useful? And certainly that might mean new kinds of business models, whether it's instrumental teaching programs, or whether it's partnering with the state governments to create new policy, or whether it's one example I can think of is a kind of architect as a GP. What if you saw 10 clients a day and you made a couple of quick spatial prescriptions instead of 10 clients a year? Really productive architects can do about 400 buildings in their whole careers.
Oh, wow.
And I just think, wow, in Melbourne, where I'm from, there are 300 people a day arriving in the city, 100,000 people a year. Where are we in those conversations? And certainly theory and certainly universities is occupying that space, making grand claims about the future of the developing world and of the exploding cities in China and so on. But we haven't really developed a tool for working at scale or for taking responsibility for the city as a whole. And I don't have the answers, but I think that we need to start asking those questions.
Yeah, that reminds me of I had read an interview with you in preparing for this, where the interviewer basically asked you a question of kind of your definition of architecture, or has your definition of architecture changed, or is architecture moving away from the building? And it really resonated with me, because I feel like that's been a question that I'm kind of asking through this podcast in a lot of ways in regards to graphic design, and kind of what is my definition of graphic design, and is it still graphic design if it moves beyond the form or from those kind of preconceived definitions? And so I hope this question doesn't sound too reductive or simple, but I'm kind of interested in how you think about those definitions, and even coming back to your book a little bit, this idea of an expanded practice. Do you have any thoughts on that, kind of in general and in your field, but any thoughts that you could kind of give to graphic designers and how to start thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, to start with architecture, and then let's see if it works when we transfer it across. One of the things one of the ways I like to think about this is to ask, what if you just shifted who you were responsible to or for? So at the moment, again, being super reductive, architects seem to be building their own portfolios. That somehow the project is like the book, the website, the magazine article, the perfect thing.
Right.
There's no measure there on how many people you've influenced, or how many people's lives you've improved. In a way that a hospital might be responsible, or more broadly, the medical profession might be more responsible in that way. Mm-hmm. So what if you were to change who you were responsible to, from being your own portfolio to being, say, the city? Like, what if you recast your role as like a custodian of the built environment, instead of saying, and that's sort of, it's semantic on the one hand, but it reframes your responsibility. You might. I read a great interview with Stefano Burri the other day, who's a architect based in Milan. He's most famous at the moment for these buildings covered in trees. He's built the first one in Milan. He's now doing them in China and so on. And he was offered a professorship at MIT in Boston. And he said, look, he turned it down. He said, because he couldn't leave Milan. because that's the place where he feels responsible to. And there's some sense that he took responsibility for that city, and to the extent where he's even run for mayor. And he's getting engaged in politics and so on. Someone for your podcast.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I think there's the image of the architect at the moment is this kind of globe-trotting, high-flying. I'm doing all my sketches on the plane type thing. And there's another version which is, well, no, I'm based here, I'm responsible here, and these are the questions which I'm going to stay and address. So that's kind of how I see it working in architecture. And then the question is, how might that fold across into graphic design? I mean, maybe you have some thoughts on that, but what if you and maybe graphic design is actually doing that more already, through things like really good, clear wayfinding.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Graphic design in a way can hit things at scale much more easily, through things like design of money and for instance, the work that government digital services are doing here in London about redesigning all the UK government's websites and digital touch points in order to make them more accessible and more clear and yes, save money for the government, but make them more inclusive. Like, that's an amazing project that is really a sort of digital / graphic design project. So I would say graphic design is already doing it.
Yeah. I mean,
it's just have to work out how to do it too.
I mean, as you were saying that, I was even thinking, I love this idea of reframing the question to be who you're responsible for, because I think that just opens up all sorts of other kind of questions and challenges about not just what we design, but how we design, which I think is a great kind of mode of operating. My final question, which is a question that I ask everybody, I'm very interested in who are the writers, the critics, the curators, the designers who have really influenced you and the way you think about all of these things.
Yeah, okay, big question, good one. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll give you two answers.
Okay.
We've mentioned Rem Koolhaas earlier in the conversation, and certainly, he's the one to blame for me leaving design and thinking more broadly about what architecture can be.
Yeah.
So certainly, I owe a lot to Rem. But I would also add, I've just finished reading a book by Dolores Hayden, who she was a professor at Yale and retired recently. This is a book that was first published in the 80s and was republished in the early 2000s, called Redefining the American Dream. And it's, I guess it's a feminist history of the home and of architecture through a gendered perspective. And it was just such a kind of revelation, a huge eye-opener for me to reconsider design from that perspective and all the presumptions that are embedded in the way that we unquestionably think about design and architecture, and particularly at a domestic scale. I would, at the moment, I'm all about Dolores Hayden.
Yeah, that is great. Those are two great answers. Rory, thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like I could talk to you for another hour or so. This was so interesting to me. I'm glad we got to do this. I'm a big fan of your work. So thank you so much
it's been
for
really
doing
fun.
This.
Thank you, Jared, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this. It's a really great project, and I'll look forward to tuning into the conversations you have to come.
This episode was recorded on November 3rd, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.